Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to be painting up this 3D printed dragon from Lost Adventures. I wanted to learn more about using oil paints on miniatures for making smooth blends, and I thought this would be a great excuse for it. So I'm challenging myself to use oils for the majority of this figure. I'm also going to be building a display base and stand for this guy, since he won't be able to stand up on his own. You can see I've already primed him in gray Rust-Oleum Automotive Filler Primer. We're going to kick things off by putting a zenithal highlight on him. Start by forgetting to put your glove on, then airbrush a black ink over the whole thing. Next, I airbrush on a titanium white ink just from above, the zenith in zenithal. Now to start with the oils. I'm going to use Indian Red for the back, arms, and legs. I started by using a new brush I bought just for oils, but the brush just flopped around, no stiffness to it at all. It may be better for watercolor or something. I started by putting paint on straight from the tube, but began thinning it just slightly with mineral spirits, just to get better coverage from it and make it go on a bit less thick. With the limbs and back done, time to move on to the yellow ochre for the wings. You'll see I put the model on a paper towel at this point. The problem was that this model doesn't have a base to set him down on, so I kept setting him down on the wingtips. This kept wearing off the paint, including the primer from the wingtips, down to the 3D printing PLA filament. I was hoping the towel, especially the blue kind, is just a tad softer, that may help out a little. It helped a bit, but it still didn't prevent it. For the belly color, I mixed yellow ochre with burnt sienna, but it turned out way too orange for my taste. I decided to add Indian Red to the mix to try to tone the orange down some. It helped some, but still wasn't quite what I wanted. I ended up thinning down some Indian Red and wet blending it directly onto the model. I did like how this turned out. Finally, for the magic of oil painting, what I wanted to challenge myself to try out, the easy blending. Because oils take so long to dry, the base coat will still be active, allowing you to blend other colors into it easily. I put dots of dark color, raw umber in this case, in the low spots, the wing creases. After this, I come back with a filbert brush to blend the dots in. I mostly used a stippling motion, with an occasional light brushing if it needed it. Wipe the blending brush off on a paper towel often, to get rid of any excess it picks up. Also, while working on blending, never touch this brush to thinner. Similarly, if you're going to work over a thinned coat, let that coat dry for a while before working on it. I did 2 passes of dark shading to reinforce the color to the point where I was happy with it. I still wanted more contrast though, so I did 1 pass of titanium white on the high points of the wing folds. I continued the shading and the highlighting on the underbelly and the tail. I was happy how this turned out, but there are a lot of details still with all of the scales, and I didn't want to take all the time to highlight each and every one by hand, so I decided to do an oil wash. Though I wasn't sure if an oil wash would be a mistake and undo all of the nice blending. I waited 1 week for the oils to dry before I gloss coated. A lot of waiting in this project for the oils to dry. I airbrushed on Vallejo gloss varnish to keep the oils from rubbing off on my hands, and also to help with spreading the oil wash. I'm using raw umber thinned with mineral spirits, so that it matches the color of the shading I did earlier. This should unify the model. I let the mineral spirits of the wash dry before I began removing wash from the high points of the model using a makeup sponge. I get more use out of my makeup sponges by cutting off the bits I've used until I'm not left with anything else that's usable. Now for washing the wings, where I'm hoping that it'll enhance the shades I've already done versus just make it irrelevant. I also remove the excess from the wings after it's dried. Looking at the model the next day, I thought the wash darkened it way too much. I should have thinned the wash out more when I did it. Thankfully, oil paints are cool in that you can come back later to change it. To fix this, I used some mineral spirits on a Q-tip to take more off of the body and the wings. Make sure to dab off some of the thinner on a paper towel before touching the model, just to give yourself more control of how much you take off at a time. For the small details, I switched to acrylics. I used P3's Menoth White Base as a bone color for the teeth and the claws. For the eyes, I wanted something that would stand out against the red, so I chose P3's Necrotite Green. After that, I came in and added a black slit for his reptile pupil. I was still unhappy with how dark the model was after the wash, so I did another pass with the Q-tip with mineral spirits to take even more of the wash off. I then waited another week for all the oils to dry again, before I put a coat of Rust-Oleum Crystal Clear Enamel Gloss. There was a lot of waiting in the project, which contributed to how long it took. I wanted the enamel gloss seal coat because I wasn't sure how sturdy all the paint and primer would stick onto the 3D printing filament. I followed this with an airbrush of AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish to cut the gloss shine. You'll see hints of gloss still where I missed some spots, but it's much more noticeable on camera with the lights than it is in person. I like how this guy turned out. The oil paint smooth blending gives it a really natural look, organic, that I'm really happy with, especially for a natural creature like a dragon. Now time to think about the base. The only contact point on this model is a small point on the tail. I wasn't confident that this would be good enough if I just glued him to a base at that point. I was afraid it would be an easy point to break off at the tail. I decided I'd have to build some kind of base that has a harness of some kind that holds him up. To start off, I took a black wire out of a bundle of Romex that I then shaped into a harness for this dragon. With the shape done, I wanted to add some padding to where the bottom of the wings would contact the model. I hot glued felt to the wire, though I ended up using way more felt than I actually needed, and trimmed off the excess later. I cut a base out of high-density fiberboard with a scroll saw, because I have a scroll saw. I have heard some people have had success scoring HDF with a utility knife and then snapping off the excess. You could also use something like poster board or maybe some plastic or cardboard, but I wanted the wood as something that weighs more to support this big dragon model. You can see me gluing the wire to the base. I chose to glue to the rough side of the wood, since that should make for a better bond. To cover up the wire and add details to the base, I dry fit some Woodland Scenics plaster rocks. I also marked the place on the base where the dragon's tail would sit. This way I could put less texture on this spot and make sure it sits okay. Once I settled on the rock placement, I hot glued them down. With the wire and rocks glued down, now it's time to start texturing the base. Using some old DAP pre-mixed stucco patch that I had, I started to texture the base. It was pretty old, so I added some water to the stucco and stirred it in. This made it usable again. When working with it, regularly wet your fingers and tools, or it'll stick to you. I've heard others use Sculptamold, but this is what I had. I really liked working with it too. It has sand or grit of some kind mixed into it already, so I didn't have to add texture afterwards. And it spread well with my finger and sculpting tool. I made sure not to add too thick of a layer where the tail is supposed to sit. Something to keep in mind is that using wet materials can have a chance of warping the basing material you put them on. Thankfully, the high-density fiberboard is so stiff it turned out just fine with this project. After I let it dry, it did shrink up some and pulled away from the rocks. I went back later and added a little more stucco into those gaps. Once completely dry, I gave it a coat of black primer and a white zenithal airbrush. I probably could have used a little more white paint, which would have helped with the contrast paint that I'm using here. I opted for using contrast paints to get good color on it without having to spend a whole lot of time. I chose snakebite leather for the rocks. Next, I wanted the ground darker than the rocks, so I used wildwood for the ground. To bring out the details of the rocks, I gave them a dry brush of Xandri dust. Shout out to Tabletop Minions for suggesting makeup brushes for dry brushing. The makeup brush gave excellent control and coverage, and I absolutely recommend them. To bring out the texture of the ground on the base, I gave it an overbrush of Baneblade Brown. An overbrush being more paint than a dry brush, but not fully painting. Here I'm finally cutting off the excess wire. I really should have done this sooner. It would have made it much easier for filming. I wanted to try something out to cover up the wire supports, and thought a dust cloud might be cool. To do this, I took some polyfill that you use for filling pillows, and airbrushed with burnt umber. To try and give some variation, I also airbrushed in some raw sienna, though I couldn't tell much of a difference, so I just went forward using just burnt umber. The color didn't really turn out how I was hoping. I would think it should be a closer match to the ground color, if that's where the dust is being generated from. I am glad I didn't glue the dust cloud onto the base, because I did decide to remove it later. As a finishing touch, I painted the rim with black. At this point, I decided to remove the dust. I thought it distracted from the model, and looked more like jetpack plumes than the dust cloud that I was hoping for. I'm really glad I followed through with this project. The challenge to use mostly oils on the dragon was a great way to learn and practice more with the medium. A large model like this was very challenging for me. I had a lot of issues with handling the model without accidentally touching areas I had just painted. Would I do it the same way if not restricting to just oils? Probably not. On something this large and unwieldy, I would probably just base coat in acrylics, then go with oil washes after that. If the figure was smaller, or had a base to hold onto while painting, then I may paint in mostly oils again, especially if I want nice, smooth blends. Guys, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Take care, good luck on your projects, and I'll see you in the next one.